Hello and welcome to our special coverage with me. I'm Abdurrahim Kashour, coming to you live from Algiers on Al24 News. Russia has pushed Ukrainian forces back from the center of Severodonetsk. The armed forces of Ukraine said Monday morning. Russia also was seeing success due to a significant advantage in artillery, said Sergei Haidai, head of the Lugansk Region Military Administration, via Telegram. Haidai said around 500 civilians, including 40 children, are still sheltering at the city's Azot chemical plant, which is coming under heavy bombardments by large caliber enemy artillery, he said. Mikhailo Podolyak, advisor to the head of the office of the Ukrainian president, via Twitter, he said, being straightforward to the end of war, we need heavy weapons parity. Ukraine is appealing for heavy weapons parity ahead of a summit of defense ministers in Brussels on Wednesday. This summit that will be held by NATO hosts the Ukrainian defense ministers, along with allied ministers and officials from Sweden, Finland, Georgia, and the European Union. Based on these reports, several questions come to the scene. First, will these new system weapons bring a solution to Ukraine? And how Putin will face this gathering of nations against his country, Russia? All of this is going to be analyzed today in our special coverage by our panel of guests. I'm joined live via Skype platform with Mr. Oleksiy Yakubin, PhD in International Relations from Ukraine, and Mr. Justin Cook, Associate Professor of International Relations from France. Gentlemen, thank you so much for accepting our invitation to this debate. The discussion begins right after this break. And before we delve into our discussion, let me read for you this piece of information. A leader of the Lugansk People's Republic, Leonid Psyatchenko, says the city is not 100% liberated, as fighting intensifies, especially near the factory of Azot. Taking Severodonetsk would open Moscow the road to another major city, Kramatorsk, a stage to conquer the entire Donbas region.
Severodonetsk is not 100% liberated. Ukrainian servicemen, participants of Nationalist Battalion, remain in the industrial zone, at the Azot factory, from where they bombarded the city. We cannot act aggressively enough there, because it is a chemical industry facility. Our main task is to clean up the industrial area so as not to commit an environmental disaster. We will achieve our goal anyway. We'll liberate the industrial zone.
Starting with you, Mr. Oleksiy, since you are in Ukraine. Dr. Oleksiy, after Russian troops withdrawn from Kyiv and put the main focus of their military operation on the eastern part of Ukraine, precisely the Donbas region, do you think that now Ukraine could sustain and resist even more this Russian concentration over this region, or it is lost and will become a Russian land, especially when residents of Donetsk and Lugansk choose to join Russia for good? And some of them recently, they have been given even Russian passports.
Actually, situation now may be in some aspect more hard than situation a few months later, before. Why? Because now, yes, some concentrated Russian troops on the Donbas and the southern part of Ukraine, and Ukrainian troops now need much more weapons. And now, in this aspect, President Zelensky calling to the West about the much more help in this aspect for Ukraine. But now we've seen that some Western countries are very slow in this process, and it's a problem because the main battlefield it's Donbas, but now Ukraine has not enough weapons and not enough some artillery, for the good protection of this territory, and they occupied some territories on Donbas. That's why, yes, for Ukraine now it's much more harder part of the this war after the invasion Russia. In these 3 months, because now maybe some crucial time about this situation. In what direction this situation will become, or to some much more helping from the West for Ukraine in arms and maybe in negotiate process, or in the situation when West in some aspect much more slower and making some distance from this, because in my opinion very interesting some not direct, but some discussion between Biden and Zelensky, when Biden said that he called to Zelensky, advised Zelensky about the Russian invasion, but Zelensky did not hear before this invasion, and so on. It's very interesting because it's some contradictions, maybe between, it demonstrates some contradictions between USA and Ukraine.
Quite understood. Mr. Justin, coming to you now as a direct question, since you are, I believe, in France, what role Francis Macron is playing in this battle between Russia and Ukraine? I mean, in the very beginning, Macron tried politics and negotiation, yet he didn't succeed. After that, his country joined to the deliveries of weapons to Ukraine. And at the same time, he said that Russia should not be humiliated after this battle come to an end. So how can you explain this sort of contradiction?
Well, I think from the French perspective, they've always prided themselves on their ability to attempt to remain somewhat impartial, even though they are on the US side and they're supporting the war efforts against the Russians. If you recall, President Sarkozy also took a position of a mediator when he was also president of the European Union, just like Macron is today, during the 2008 Russian-Georgian war. They made an attempt to allow an overture of a sorts in the event the conflict de-escalates to some extent. And I think with the objective of avoiding a World War III and having a war that is prolonged by 3 or 4 or even 5 more years, something that's similar to what happened in Syria or even the 2 wars that took place in Chechnya, I think it's a good position to maintain, to allow negotiations to take place. But on the question of humiliations, again, if we're talking about the end of the war and Russia's defeated on the battlefield, then the notion of humiliation should be avoided, and it definitely has a role to play in reconstructing, a new Europe with Russia and not exactly against Russia. Now, in part of that, it's going to depend on the United States, because there are some hawkish politicians in the United States that not only want to see Russia defeated, but also want to ensure that Russia is no longer ever capable of waging such a major war in the near or distant future. So it's not only going to depend on the French from that perspective, but in terms of humiliations now, I'm not sure if I follow completely how the Russians would be humiliated now. They're making incremental gains in the eastern part of Ukraine. From their perspective, they're winning the war. They're going to achieve their objectives, no matter the difficulties that they've encountered. And from a social psychological perspective, when it comes to humiliations, the consideration of the other is important. And I'm not so sure how much consideration that Vladimir Putin has for Macron or for the United States at this point in time.
I'm sorry to cut your train of thought, Mr. Justin, but talking about humiliation, I believe the main idea, as Dmytro Kuleba, Ukraine Foreign Minister, said that this is a really shameful statement from Francis Macron. And all those countries who works with France in this position, they should feel ashamed of themselves, because they are considered they are with Russia with this statement. What are you saying about this?
Well, you can understand the Ukrainian perspective. They know they have a long way to go, and the war effort is going to be extremely difficult. Their victory on the battlefield is not guaranteed. In fact, short-term prospects show that they're kind of losing the war. Now, there's a lot of questions that remain open also on the Russian side. If the Russians are indeed winning the war, you have to kind of measure it by objectives. And if their objective was to control just the Donbass region and Crimea, that's not a major victory in itself. So the Ukrainians understand that because this is going to be a protracted war, they need continued and sustainable long-term support. And that is Zelensky's job. They've got to do everything they can to get support, financial support, military support, and ensure that their allies remain on the same page, that there's no war fatigue, where allies start scratching their heads and saying, okay, what are we actually receiving in return for all this investment in Ukraine? So, bringing Finland and Sweden into the war effort, along with the Germans, even the Swiss.
Understood, Mr. Justin. We will come to this point. Thank you so much. Now, moving on to the second point, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen claimed during the briefing in Kyiv with the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky that the Commission is working day and night on the assessment of Ukraine's eligibility as a possible candidate for EU membership. Also, the Ukrainian president emphasized on the necessity of integrating Ukraine into the EU, describing the conflict as just a first stage in Moscow's plan to divide Europe and weaken it.
The Commission is currently preparing the recommendations, the so-called opinion.
Ukraine is the first stage of this aggression in these plans. That's why the European Union's positive response to Ukraine's application for membership can be a positive response to the question of whether the European project has a future at all.
Mr. Alexei, coming back to you, it seems that now we have a different kind of confrontation. It's all about long-range missiles and the new system weapons. So if Ukraine could have the availability of these weapons, would that help Ukraine to win against Russia, or it will only buy them a little, it will only buy them a little time? In other words, a prolonged war, as Putin claimed.
Well, from Ukrainian position, yes, it's very important. And new weapons, for example, artillery and ballistic for the de-occupied some territory, especially some de-blockade some Ukrainian ports, on the Black Sea. It's important aspect, but another important aspect, it's some maybe test for the European Union about some enlargement strengthen of the European Union, because now for Ukraine, crucial, important, it's not only some arms, from the West, but some perspectives about the rebuilding of the country. And from Ukrainian perspective, this situation connects to the Ukrainian perspective joined to the European Union. Maybe some, it's some test not only for Ukraine, but test for the European Union about the status of the candidate to the join to the European Union. Because now Ukraine has millions of refugees on the European territory. For example, ambassador of the EU in Ukraine talking about the special to form special body, governmental body for these refugees to support some idea of the opposition political Yuri Boyko in this aspect. That's why for Ukraine now very important. It's not only weapons aspect of this battle, but also political perspective, and maybe and some position of the French president, for example, or Chancellor of the Germany in this situation very important.
Okay, quite understood. Coming to you, Mr. Justin, in the same line of thoughts, Macron said it will take decades for Ukraine to join the EU. At the same time, France and all the EU countries are helping Ukraine, but they still refusing its joining. And what Ukraine should provide to be accepted in the EU?
Well, that is an important remark that the EU has made for Ukraine's application as candidate, as an applicant to the EU, that it's the first step in a very long process, as it's traditionally been. And we're in a very special moment in history regarding the EU expansion, because first time we have a candidate that is in war with a major superpower such as Russia. So I don't think I think the EU is going to remain flexible on some issues, just as they were flexible for Greece's integration back in the early 80s regarding the percentage of GDP to debt. But ultimately, the geopolitical situation, the economic situation of Ukraine are going to play an important role. I'm not sure how the EU could allow a member state to remain in a war with Russia and to be a member of the EU. That would be absolutely unprecedented. And also from an economic perspective, the war has to come to an end. I think the reconstruction of the country has to take place. And we understand how important the economic difficulties have been for the EU over the last 10 years with the Great Recession. Let's not forget about Iceland's suspension of their candidacy in 2009 due to economic concerns. The Greek sovereign debt crisis in 2012, which was a major crisis that led to a number of EU states questioning as to whether or not they wanted to remain in the EU. And without forgetting Brexit. So the EU is in a delicate position here from an economic perspective, and it is going to take time. And I really think that the war will have to come to an end before they completely become full-fledged members of the EU.
Quite understood. Very good indeed. Ukrainian Deputy Foreign Minister Dmytro Synik stated on Sunday that his country has established 2 routes via Poland and Romania to export grains, but they have a bottleneck that have slowed supply chain. Synik added that global food security was at risk due to Russian military operation, as Ukraine is unable to export grains due to a Russian blockade at its Black Sea ports.
First of all, Ukraine is known to be a global contributor to food security, and we're doing our best to ensure that those 22 million tons of grain that are now blocked in the ports, in the Ukrainian seaports, blocked by Russia, will reach their destination. It's not about Ukraine, it's about the international order. And for the port of Odessa, which is under the control of Ukraine, as it is not operable now, we are using alternative routes with the help of our friends and partners, namely Romania, Poland and Baltic states. We found 2 routes, we established 2 routes which help us export these agriculture commodities. I do not have any numbers now, and those routes are not perfect because it creates certain bottleneck, but we are doing our best to develop those routes in the meantime.
Mr. Justin, staying with you, Luca Russo, who works as an analyst for food crisis within the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, he said, "We need to clarify that today there is no global food shortage. Food is available. To give you a number, each year the world produces about 780 million metric tons of wheat, and the shortage of this year is only 3 million. So, how is the Ukraine crisis threatening food supply?"
Well, it's a great question, because we've also understood over the period of time that despite the fact that Russia and Ukraine are both major producers and exporters of wheat and grain in the world, Russia's supply is still, uninhibited. So it's only a question of Ukraine, and the EU is not dependent on Ukrainian wheat and grain. They're self-sufficient in this regard. However, one of the major concerns are for a number of the African countries, or even for the Middle East. Lebanon imports 82% of its grain, Qatar 64%, Somalia 70%, along with Libya and Tunisia at 50%. So one of the major concerns is that there's going to be a major famine in Africa within a very short period of time. And if one thinks the crisis is bad now with the high energy prices and the high prices on food, it's only going to increase. Ukraine is not capable of harvesting all of its wheat. It still has a lot of wheat in its silos that it's unable to export. The export routes through Romania are going to take a very, very long time. Despite the fact that maybe we have some type of overture with Turkey, who's proposed to open and establish a corridor for the exportation of grain. But it's a very strategic perspective from the Russian one that's not so dissimilar to their energy policy in order to apply pressure. Now, if we head towards a major humanitarian crisis and weak crisis, there's two things that can play out. The first one is that the Western countries hit some type of war fatigue. They have some type of empathy towards the people that are suffering. Let's not forget that the Americans intervened in Somalia in the early 1990s due to a famine. This might turn their attention towards something that might be more pressing at the same time. It might get them to back down on sanctions, though it's not the case right now. On the other hand, it could allow Russia to, come in as kind of the victor in this situation, to say, hey, okay, we're going to deal with the famine in Africa. Nonetheless, if we have a void that's created, a void will be filled by one of the major actors, whether it's a security void, like after the end of World War II with the creation of NATO and the Marshall Plan, whether it's the withdrawal from the United States' withdrawal from Iraq or Afghanistan, which was filled by other actors. This is a good opportunity to have someone come in and fill that void.
Thank you ever so much for this explanation. Mr. Alexei, reports said that the world was already witnessing the food crisis in several countries, especially in the African ones, due to the severe drought and economic crisis. So why would Ukraine and the West pointing finger to Russia as the main reason for this food crisis and grain shortages?
Well, situation now in this aspect that West did not create some sanction in a Russian case about the food, about the game, but in my opinion, now Russia to use this situation with some fears about the fears about some product problems, to use this situation for the some maybe softy their West sanction against Russia. Because in my opinion, maybe West in this situation much need a much more strong policy in the Russian case, because not Ukraine blocked our Black Sea ports. It's from the Russia position, and for me it's very strange. For example, that some negotiate between Turkey and Russia. This negotiate behind the Ukrainian shadows, because Ukraine in this negotiate did not join. It's some ideas, Turkey, Russia, but Ukraine in this situation has clear position that Ukraine need deblocate Black Sea ports, not only for the gain, but for the import and export, because Ukraine needs these ports not in the aspect of the food situation, but for another products. And very important aspect, it's some arms for this from West, that Ukraine in this situation itself has some strength to deblocate maybe these ports, not it's a goodwill from the Russia or Turkey, because in Ukraine, in some aspect, did not trust for these efforts.
Quite understood, Mr. Alexei. Now moving on to another topic. Russian Day, the National Day of the Russian Federation, was celebrated across the country with concerts and various festivals. It was also marked in Ukraine as the Russian flags were raised in Lugansk and Donetsk, based in Ukraine. Russian President Vladimir Putin attends the State Pride Award ceremony while making Russia Day in Kremlin in Moscow since 1992. Russia Day is annually celebrated on the 12th of June as the Russian Federation's national holiday. The holiday marks the country's declaration of state sovereignty from the Soviet Union on June 12, 1990.
с государственным праздником, который посвящен нашей...
I congratulate you and all the citizens of the country on Russia Day, on a public holiday that is dedicated to our native country, that is filled with pride and its history and faith. Today we're especially acutely aware of how important it is for the fatherland of our society, for the people to be united. We're proud of the accomplishments and victories of our ancestors, of all who aspired and was able to move forward, discover new things, achieve progressive development of the fatherland, defend the homeland in battles, and assert its decent role in the world.
Coming to you, Mr. Alexis, since it is happening in Ukraine, Russia intensified its attacks in the eastern Ukraine on Sunday, while holding events to celebrate a Russian national holiday in areas that Moscow claims are now under its control. So, how can you read this move by the Russians?
From Ukrainian position in the some language, it's not a liberated territory, this occupied territory. And I look at some celebrate ceremonies in Lugansk, Donetsk, or in the east, on the southern part of Ukraine. And this ceremony, in my opinion, was not very popular by the locals. Not much more people join to this ceremony. Maybe for the Russia, it's important because they, in this aspect, can apologize and to create some legitimating, maybe position that this territory join to the Russia maybe in future, and this territory celebrating this. But in my opinion, it's not very popular for the locals. For example, in the southern part of Ukraine, much more people thinking that this is situation much more problematic for these people, because now this territory occupied in some aspect by the Russia in some shadow status. It's not a territory of Russia because this did not recognize Ukraine or international community. And this territory, in fact, occupied by Russia, but without some status, for example, status for the annexation Crimea. It's some shadow zone. And in my opinion, for some people on this territory, in this status much more problematic. But from Russia position, maybe it's clear that Russia, maybe Vladimir Putin, want to re-establish in some aspect Russian empire in 21st century. And from Russian position, it's some steps to this. But empire in the 21st century, it's, in my opinion, it's a very strange status.
Sunday, NATO Secretary General John Stoltenberg said that the organization was working with Turkey to overcome Turkish opposition to Finland and Sweden joining NATO. The Nordic nations were forced to join NATO by Russia's conflict in Ukraine, but Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has cited that Kurdistan Workers' Party's actions on as one of his country's concerns to their participation.
The summit in Madrid was never a deadline. At the same time, I would like to see this solved as soon as possible, and therefore we are working hard with our NATO ally Turkey, and also with Finland and Sweden to address those issues that Turkey has raised. And these are legitimate concerns. This is about terrorism, it's about weapons exports. And we have to understand and remember that no other NATO ally has suffered more terrorist attacks than Turkey.
Mr. Justin, coming back to you, Russian main target behind this military operation was to stop the NATO expansion eastward Europe. But now, Sweden, Finland has applied to join this alliance. Could we say that Russia has failed to reach the ultimate goal, which is preventing NATO to be enlarged precisely near the Russian borders?
Without a doubt, it's given NATO another raison d'etre, I would say, in the post-Cold War period, when at a time many European states and NATO states were becoming critical of NATO. For sure, it's actually increased the level of insecurity, the sentiment and perception of insecurity, whereas just a few years ago, our major threat was sub-state actors and terrorism. Now the major threat is the return of an old conventional threat, and that is Russia. So it's done everything but divide the Europeans. So this is one of the major misperceptions, I think, the shocking misperceptions that took place and took shape here. From the Turkish perspective, what is interesting here is that the Turkish are holding all the cards. They're not in a hurry to get this agreement done with. They're going to use it to negotiate to their likings the situation. They're looking for some important concessions from the Swedes and the Finlands with regard to the PKK and the support of terrorism. It was absolutely critical that Stoltenberg officially and openly recognized these Turkish concerns. Turkey is a really an important member of NATO from a security and strategic point of view. They've got the second largest standing military in NATO. They control the Dardanelles and the Bosporus, which controls the imports and exports and commerce coming from in and out of the Black Sea into the Mediterranean. So they want to remind everyone that they have a role to play in the middle of this conflict. And I think they're going to take their time before they come to a decision. But I ultimately think that they're going to side with NATO, that they're going to conduct some backdoor negotiations, and they're going to come to an agreement eventually, but they're going to take their time achieve their objectives.
Quite understood. I have been called to put an end for this discussion because we have reached the limited time for this show. So, Mr. Oleksiy, thank you so much. You joined us from Ukraine. Mr. Justin, you joined us from France. Thank you ever so much for being with us. Thank you, dear our viewers, for being here with us in Al 24 News. Thank you for now. Bye-bye.